The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 52. Epilogue. Following the war, days stretched into weeks, and months into years. For Richard and Linda, life slowly reverted back to normal, or at least a new normal. They settled into a life with both their mundane and magical friends, occasionally dining with Malfoys, the Lupins, Augusta or Dumbledore, and the Jugson Blacks. Both Richard and Linda were awarded Orders of Merlin, 2nd class, for their help in defeating Lord Voldemort. Richard hung his medal in one of the patient rooms at their dental practice, and enjoyed inventing fantastical stories about how he'd earned this prestigious mystery award for the patients. At least, everyone assumed they were made up. With the joking manner of Dr. Granger, one could never be sure. For his part in the war, Lucius was tried by the Wizengamot and ultimately acquitted. He embarked upon a new career later in life, but more about that later. Narcissa and Linda decided to take up doubles tennis, and with a good deal of practice, and a tiny bit of magical trickery, managed to enter the women's doubles tournament at Wimbledon after a couple of years of playing together. There, they were soundly defeated in the first round by a team from Argentina, 6-2, 6-1. But their husbands and children were there on a cloudy Monday afternoon to cheer them on from the nearly empty grandstands of Court 14, and that made it feel as though they had won the entire tournament, all the same. Remus eventually left MI6 and joined the team at Fixer Elixir Limited. It gave him more freedom in his schedule, which was helpful, considering how busy his and Tonks's family lives became within a handful of years. Baby Teddy soon became the older brother to 3 more little ones. As for Tonks, she was happy to pass on the mantle of Wix, only a few years after the war, to Harry Potter, who passed it to Pansy Parkinson a few years after that. Tonks went on after several years to become Chief Witch of the Wizengamot. Lupin took over Richard's role with Fixer Elixir, and within a few short years, he, along with Sirius and Quentin, had turned it into a major global brand. It financed stadiums, sponsored high-profile professional sports events, and expanded into the health foods, entertainment, and travel industries. In the summer of 1999, after a lengthy licensing negotiation, the Magic Straw finally appeared in McDonald's Happy Meals. The toys were in high demand, and within a few years were considered highly collectible, even more popular than the teeny beanie babies that appeared in Happy Meals the following year. To this day, an original new-in-wrapper Magic Straw can fetch nearly £1,000 on eBay. In the summer of 2024, for the 25th anniversary of the Magic Straw, McDonald's did a limited 1-week release of the straws, resulting in their highest-grossing sales in years. Sirius and Quentin married and had 2 children born via surrogacy. Ginny Weasley was happy to help the couple achieve their dream of parenthood between her numerous stellar seasons with the Holyhead Harpies. Ron Weasley married Luna Lovegood. She became proficient at wand-making, taking over for Ollivander a few years later when he retired. Ron took up baking as a hobby, then expanded it into a business, partnering with Florian Fortescue in Diagon Alley. He enjoyed coming up with themed, fanciful creations, and even competed in the Great British Bake Off in 2016, with a few transfigurations to his appearance, and a new Muggle name of Andrew. Lucius Malfoy, no amateur when it came to cakes, tarts, and biscuits, became one of his biggest customers. Neville and Pansy broke up soon after the war, and he left Britain to, quote, find himself. Pansy threw herself into the DMLE and Aura training to get over him. When Neville returned from his sojourn in 2004, He toiled tirelessly to win back her affections. They married in 2008, and their oldest son, Augustus, begins Hogwarts next fall. Headmaster Snape relinquished the role of headmaster to Professor McGonagall, and after a brief sabbatical, took over as potions master, again when Slughorn retired. He and his wife, whom he began dating formally not long after the Battle of Hogwarts, lived and worked at the school until old age. When Madame Pomfrey finally retired a couple of years after the battle, many were more than a bit shocked to learn that she'd moved into the owner's quarters at the Hogshead Inn. Linda was happy for the couple, and she, along with Tonks and Narcissa, visited the pub a few times each year for Angels' reunions. Dumbledore assisted Kingsley Shacklebolt, who was named interim minister after the war, in setting up a more fair and tolerant way of life in Wizarding Britain. Eventually, he moved from Black House to the village of Godric's Hollow, and settled down to a quiet life. He enjoyed the company of his former colleagues and students, many of whom stopped in regularly to visit. He and Augusta Longbottom developed a surprise late-in-life friendship and romance about 5 years after the war. They were inseparable, and when she died in late 2017, he passed away only a few months later. Harry Potter devoted his life to catching dark wizards and outing wrongdoing wherever he found it. He was a steadfast uncle and godfather to countless friends' children. He tried his best to stay out of the public eye, granting only very occasional interviews. After a distinguished career at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, he decided to give teaching a real chance, becoming the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts. In their early 50s, he and Ginny Weasley married in a quiet ceremony next to the Black Lake at Hogwarts, neither eager to replicate the spectacle that was Ron and Luna's wedding at the Burrow several years before. He and Ginny never had children. Harry was determined to live a long, happy, and quiet life, marginally aware that the final piece of Voldemort's soul rested within him. Very occasionally, he would have a bout of unexplainable anger or restlessness, seemingly out of nowhere. Whilst this bothered him, he soon learned that drinking one of Sirius's energy drinks was oddly calming at those times. For some inexplicable reason, he developed a taste for McDonald's, and found himself dining there nearly once a fortnight. But overall, the minuscule and contained piece of Voldemort within him simply lay dormant and ineffective. That didn't stop Richard, Remus, or Tonks from keeping a watchful eye on him for several years thereafter. Voldemort was cremated with his straw, and his ashes were buried by Hagrid in an unmarked grave deep in the Forbidden Forest. The only unintentional visitors to his grave are the occasional passing giants, who have indeed learned to live in harmony. They were befriended by Hagrid, who helped them form a fairly decent jazz band. They've been known to host concerts on the Hogwarts Quidditch pitch during holiday weekends. And as for Draco and Hermione, they both returned for an 8th year at Hogwarts to make up for their awful 7th year. After finishing school, they both started advanced training at Cambridge, the Muggle university that had a wizarding division. Draco studied potions, whilst Hermione gravitated to the practice of law, both Muggle and magical. Despite his serious desire to bed his witch, Draco remained steadfast in his adherence to the rules of betrothal for quite a while. Around Boxing Day of 1999, whilst celebrating at home with Narcissa and Lucius, Draco's father got a bit too tipsy one night in his study as he and his son shared a fire whiskey. Lucius made a vague and awkward reference to Draco's sex life. The younger Malfoy wizard was quick to assure his father that he was abiding by the strictures of his future betrothal contract. Lucius's surprise and disbelief at this news was only rivaled by his amusement at his son's dedication to the institution of betrothal.
Draco, we only told you that so that you wouldn't have any slip-ups and father a child out of wedlock before you could perfect a contraception charm. Salazar's bollocks, you really haven't—"
Lucius gasped between drunken giggles. Draco was so enraged that he stormed from his father's study and called his elf, Pym. After a few careful instructions, he apparated directly to the Granger's front porch and knocked urgently. Richard showed him in. Draco was even more on edge and nervous than he had been the first time he visited several years before.
"Dr. Granger, I sincerely apologize for bursting in this way,"
he began, pacing in his agitation.
"Miney, will you accompany me to Paris for New Year's Eve tomorrow night?"
"Oh, well, that sounds lovely, Draco, but won't we miss your parents' gala? I know you'd been looking forward to it."
"Frankly, I don't give a damn about a gala right now,"
Draco answered with visible agitation, carding his fingers through his hair.
"So you'll go with me?"
"Oh, of course, that sounds brilliant. When do you want to leave?" she asked.
"Right now. Yesterday. Salazar. Last year,"
Draco said with immense and happy relief, his hands clutching her waist.
"Let's go now. Don't bother packing. I'll buy you a whole new wardrobe there."
Well, tonight we were just going to have a late dinner and watch a holiday film. I'm not sure if it's all right with Mum and Dad," she began.
"Ah, geez, of course it is, sweet," said Richard.
"Go, have fun," Linda said, giving the two of them a tiny smirk. After the young couple disappeared in a swirl of disapparition, Richard turned in confusion to his wife.
"Do you have any idea what that was all about?"
Linda, who had gathered a bit of what was going on in Draco's mind from conversations with Hermione and Narcissa over the last couple of years, gave her husband an abbreviated, father-friendly version of the story. "I believe Draco has been under the impression that they couldn't— well, let's just say he thought he had to remain pure unless he was engaged to be married, or there would be dire consequences. Apparently, someone finally told him that wasn't entirely the case."
"Ah, geez. He really is his father's son in some ways,"
Richard said, as they chuckled together. "Well, Hermione loves him, and we can't always help who we love. I mean, the man I love has a mouse tattoo on his arse cheek, and once created an energy drink in order to overthrow an evil wizard," Linda quipped. Richard wagged his brows at her.
"He sounds like a right git, love. Why don't you ditch that prat and marry me instead?"
He took her by the hand and led her up the stairs to their room, both of them laughing between kisses as they went. December 31st, 1999. Paris was beautiful as always, despite recovering from a Boxing Day windstorm. They'd arrived by back-to-back apparitions that Thursday, and true to his word, Draco had far more clothes than she needed delivered to the expansive penthouse flat that the Malfoy family maintained on Rue de l'Université, not far from the Eiffel Tower. They'd dined on rich and decadent French food for 3 days now, and were now nibbling on simple paninis of ham and cheese as they sipped champagne on the balcony, waiting for the tower to light up, signaling midnight. Draco's arm was draped around her shoulder. In truth, he had hardly taken his hands off of her in the 3 days since they'd arrived. Once he had explained exactly what his father had let slip to him, he and Hermione wasted no time in thoroughly deflowering each other. Their first time together was sweet and explorative, punctuated by bits of nervous laughter. It was over in less than 3 minutes, of course. Draco had quite a number of years of desire built up within him, but the succeeding love-making sessions had been slower, more gentle. Now, as the excitement of the crowd passing below them built, Draco could feel his own excitement growing within him as the new year approached. Would you like to go inside, love?" he asked, with half-lidded eyes and a teasing smirk.
"Draco, we'll miss the tower lights."
"I can make you see fireworks, if that's all you're looking for," he murmured, pulling her wrist towards him and kissing it gently. She smiled knowingly and left the balcony doors open, casting a warming charm to keep out the night chill. He lay her down upon the bed, carefully untying her silken robe and letting it fall open around her gorgeous body. Then he crawled up the bed, his lips winding a path that took him from her shins to her knees, then to her thighs. When he reached her center, he felt her push a bit off the bed, rising as though to stop him because of her uncertainty.
"Oh, I don't know. You don't have to," she began.
"Hermione, I have dreamed of doing this for so long. Please, don't deny me this, love," he said, in an aching voice.
She resettled uneasily, uncertain of what was to come. It turned out she was to come. Twice, in fact. His tongue danced a fine line up and down her center, licking a broad and soft stripe along her aching cunt. She arched and nearly pulled away from him. The sensation was so intense and overwhelming. He grabbed her by the hips and pulled her closer, securely attaching himself to her as he licked and moaned. His lips and teeth moved in a longing, velvety waltz along her quim. After several minutes, she lay boneless and nearly weeping in giddiness, electric aftershocks zipping through her body. Vaguely, she was aware of music coming from somewhere, and she was uncertain if it was being played outside or happening inside her mind. She found that she did not care. Her racing heart fought to slow itself to the languid drumbeat of the music. Draco crawled further up the bed, still kissing as he came, platinum blonde locks falling into his eyes, disheveled from where she had been carding her fingers through his hair. She ran her hands along the smooth, firm lines of his lean and muscular body. Godric, she loved him so much. When his lips reached her mouth, she could still taste a bit of herself on his tongue. She sighed, so content that she found it hard to believe she might ever want to leave this bed. He turned his weight on his left side, tilting himself to the bed as his hands on her waist pulled her atop him. She sat up with a slow, lazy smile, straddling his waist, brushing her fingertips lightly down his chest and abdomen. She could feel the light but insistent press of his cock behind her on her bum, and she smiled. "I love you. I can't wait to spend the next year with you," she said.
"The next year, the next century, the next millennium, love," he corrected.
"Well, actually, the next millennium doesn't start until next year," she began in her swartiest scholar voice, but he shushed her.
"I know the 21st century doesn't start until 2001, Hermione, but you have to admit, this feels close enough."
She smiled at him, pursing her lips in silent agreement. This did feel close enough, she thought. She raised up slightly, then centered herself over his cock, its glorious length standing firmly, desperately ready for her. As she slid herself down his length, taking the entirety of him inside of her, they both sighed with the overwhelming pleasure of the moment. They began to move in tandem, his hands working her against him at her hips, her sex thrusting against his. A minute or so later, outside, the countdown began. 10, 9, 8. He licked one thumb, and reached his hand between them, pressing lightly against her clit, his eyes widening as her body clenched tighter around his cock. Her copper eyes flew open and met his silver ones, each of them searching for and finding an anchor within each other. 7, 6, 5, 4. The pleasure within them both built,
built higher and faster and tighter, pulsing into a crescendo together. Their movements became more intensive, more labored. The waves of ecstasy grew stronger within both of them. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! Both of them arched against the other, their fingers interlaced, eyes meeting in fiery passion. After a moment, she collapsed against him, her body chilled not by any cold, but by the currents of gratification that ran through it. "I love you so much, Hermione." He proposed the following day, on a little pedal boat that they rented at the Bois de Boulogne. Whilst their pedal boat skills had vastly improved from their first nautical sojourn, Draco found that kneeling on a pedal boat was nearly impossible. Without the assistance of magic, they certainly would have capsized. Their wedding took place after classes ended the following summer, in July 2001, in the first true year of the new millennium, as Hermione was quick to point out. The beautiful and lavish affair, planned to perfection by Narcissa and Linda with occasional guidance from the happy couple, was certainly the event of the year. For Narcissa and Linda it was 2 dreams come true, seeing their perfect children married to each other. For Richard's part, he was mostly pleased that he didn't have to pay for this over-the-top sumptuous affair. He'd have needed a lot more than 3 jobs if he'd had to. Being a dentist, a secret military operative, and an energy drink mogul didn't even scratch the surface of the cost for this wedding, he knew. He approached the happy couple, extracting them from an overly boring conversation with a few of his old dentist friends. "It's a lovely wedding, Crabcake. Truly spectacular. And so full of emotions," Richard said to his daughter and son-in-law with a hug. Hermione recognized the trap when she saw it, but Draco accepted the hug with a confused look on his face. "Sorry, Dr. Granger, what do you mean?" "Even the wedding cake is in tears," Richard said with a smile. "Dad," Hermione smiled in spite of herself, "go keep Lucius company. He looks lonely over there." Richard left Hermione explaining the joke to her new husband and stepped nimbly away to seek out his friend. As for Lucius, his son's wedding day was a day of revelations. As he and Richard stood to one side of the elaborately decorated ballroom, watching the guests exclaim over the decor and food, Lucius noticed a tall, distinguished gentleman enter. He wore a Muggle uniform of some sort, his chest emblazoned with the glint of dozens of medals. The man looked around appraisingly with a wide smile, as if surveying the fruits of his own labor. "Richard, who is that man?" he asked, inclining his head to indicate the man. Richard tilted to look around Lucius, then straightened up with a grimace. "Ah, geez. Linda said he'd been invited, but I didn't think he'd actually come. That's Hermione's biological father." What do you mean?" Lucius's face was a study of confusion and shock. It suddenly occurred to Richard that, in all the excitement immediately after the Second Wizarding War, he'd never actually set the record straight with Lucius about Hermione's parentage. Somehow, it had never come up. Well, no time like the present, he thought. Hermione and Draco were married now, for better or worse. Richard had a strong feeling that even if Lucius wished to change that fact after learning the truth, Draco would likely find a polite but forceful way of telling his father to get fucked. "So, Lucius, I know at one time you believed that Hermione was Voldemort's child." Lucius gave him a frightened look, but to his credit, did not interrupt. "But, in actuality, her father was a Muggle. It's that tosser, that man." Richard jerked his thumb towards the Lieutenant General making his glad-handing rounds across the room. Lucius's eyes widened, taking in the handsome, dashing Muggle in his trim uniform, whilst he schmoozed the gathered wedding guests as though he were the host for the evening. Finally, Lucius spoke.
Bellatrix managed to seduce. Richard stopped him.
No, jeez. About that. Hermione's mother was also a Muggle.
Lucius's hand came up to slap his own forehead.
Are you serious?
Nope. My name's still Richard. But I'm not joking, if that's what you're asking,
Richard answered with a smile.
Gods! I cannot believe it, Richard. Next, I suppose you'll tell me that you aren't actually the Dark Lord's cousin.
Lucius was shaking his head in disbelief. Richard was silent, looking anywhere but at Lucius.
Salazar's anus, Richard! Truly!
Lucius appeared to think hard for a moment.
Then why, in Merlin's name, did you choose to become a Death Eater?
Richard sighed and looked pointedly at the blonde wizard.
It's a funny story, Lucius, but let's save it for dinner next week. For now, General Sterling is heading in our direction. He's the king of sardonic compliments, so gather your defences. Hopefully your backhand is strong.
Lucius looked momentarily confused.
What do you mean?
Richard sighed.
Just, he likes to get in his little digs when we see each other. Sometimes calls me by my old rank from when I was still a medic, even though he knows I'm a doctor and that I moved up the ranks in a different trajectory. Or he refers to Hermione as a chip off the old block. Remarks about how well she's turned out despite not having him in her life. I'm sure he's over there taking credit for nearly all of this. As I said, a bit of a tosser.
Lucius looked thunderous at the suggestion that someone other than themselves might take credit for the luxuriant affair happening in this ballroom tonight. But before he could speak, they were set upon by the aggrandizing general officer.
It's Corporal Granger! How goes it, old chap?
The supremely confident man grasped Richard's hand in one grip, and his elbow in the other, continuing on without waiting for an answer.
It's been too long! How is the medical corps treating you these days?
Richard gritted his teeth into a smile.
Sterling, old man, corking to see you here. It's Dr. Granger now, though.
The man gave a falsely abashed guffaw.
Of course! I always forget.
Always, murmured Richard, even as the decorated officer turned to Lucius.
And with that hair, you must be the father of the groom.
Sterling leaned in conspiratorially, as though sharing a secret joke with the wizard.
Lieutenant General Sterling, father of the bride.
He stuck out a hand for Lucius to shake, leaning in further and smirking.
Not really, of course, though I did my part.
Lucius shook the man's hand distastefully.
Lucius Malfoy.
And what is it you do, Lucius?
The pompous man asked.
I'm in the import-export business.
Lucius provided. It was the vague cover story decided upon by the Malfoys and Grangers, should the magical folk be asked where their obscene wealth had come from.
Really? And what is it that you import and export?
The man challenged with a grin.
Precious gems. Goods and services.
Lucius said with a raised brow.
Yes. Well, as they say, diamonds are forever.
Sterling enthused.
From where are you operating?
Lucius answered through thinned lips.
We're headquartered in Wiltshire.
A moonraker.
Sterling chuckled. Lucius growled and made a move with his hand towards his pocket, but Richard stepped smoothly between them.
Sterling, let me point you to your table. I believe we're about to make the toast to the happy couple.
Sterling sauntered off in the direction to which he was pointed, leaving the two fathers alone to commiserate.
I find that I do not care for this man, Lucius said. Calling a man from Wiltshire a moonraker is the equivalent to telling him that his feet are dirty, his children are stupid, and his wife is ugly.
You're not alone. I rather detest him a bit myself, though he gets along quite well with Hamish and Octavia, you know. They invited him. You know what they say about the difference between in-laws and outlaws? The outlaws are wanted, Richard said to him with a sideways look. Lucius, inexplicably, got on well with his parents-in-law himself. He had been known to exchange the occasional letter with Hamish Cavendish, and had even accompanied Octavia to a couple of museums. Still, if you ever fancy an extraction of this man, you know where to find me, Lucius offered. Raking the moon in Wiltshire? Lucius gave him a hardened stare, before the two men shared a small laugh. Well, if you're interested, I can always send him a Patronus, here and there. As you know, Muggles with a familial affiliation with the magical world can see and hear them, but ordinary Muggles cannot. He'll think he's going mad. Lucius's eyes glimmered with possibilities. Richard smiled a bit wickedly. No need. I've rigged the seating chart so that he's at a table with the Dursleys, as well as Snape and his lady friend, he said, gesturing to the far table. If anyone can break that man's spirit, it's that group. Lucius appraised the grouping, his own smile growing equally wicked. Already, Snape's lady friend had dragged a beaded shawl through Sterling's champagne. Vernon Dursley was currently trying to monopolize the Lieutenant General's attention. From his fairly lewd hand gestures, the discussion was about Dursley's business, Grunnings, which made drills.
I know the way to take that table conversation from good to great,
Lucius said, his smile growing ever wider as he surreptitiously brandished to his friend the tiny vial of veritaserum, hidden in his Muggle-style white tie coat. Richard laughed quietly.
Moonraker, the world is not enough for your deviousness.
The two men laughed as Snape simply stared daggers at Richard, recognizing the Muggle man's hand in orchestrating his current torture. The wedding was beautiful, the honeymoon divine. Draco and Hermione settled in an opulent flat in London and began their lives together. There were 3 adorable children, all of whom were named without input from the grandmothers, thanks very much. All 3 went on to earn top grades at Hogwarts. All 3 prefects. 2 were head boy and girl in their years. The 3rd was Quidditch captain for their house team. In the end, Draco and Hermione raised 1 Slytherin, 1 Gryffindor, and 1 Ravenclaw. Tonks always insisted that they should have had a 4th, in order to have a Hufflepuff, but Draco was quick to tell her that they could have had 20 children and still not produced a Hufflepuff. And they lived happily ever after. Sure, there was the occasional hiccup, when their 5-year-old daughter Miranda turned Octavia's hair stark white one Christmas. The confusion of Hamish and the panic of Linda, Hermione, and all 3 Malfoys was matched only by the wheezing guffaws of Richard. He was so overcome with laughter, in fact, that he had to excuse himself to the garage to recover. Once things were set to rights, with a bit of transfiguration and obliviation, Richard proudly informed Miranda in private that she was his favourite granddaughter. As she was his only granddaughter, this was no surprise, but Miranda's silver eyes danced smugly at her brothers anyway. But on the whole, the Grangers and Malfoys learned to live in near-perfect harmony. The foursome and their children, and then some years on, their children's children, attended the Giants' concerts, spectated at Quidditch or football matches, travelled the world, and shared an occasional unpotioned Newcastle or ginger gin after dinner. When Richard and Linda retired from dentistry in 2010, the 4 embarked on a couple's trip around the globe. Narcissa and Linda enjoyed Christmas markets in Germany, Fashion Week in Milan, street bazaars in Morocco, and the 700-mile Route 127 yard sale in the United States. Meanwhile, Richard was able to convince his wizard friend to branch out from Oreos, trying all sorts of Muggle treats, much to Lucius's delight. Lucius was always very careful to steer quite clear of anything labelled dark chocolate, however. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great78.